High above the North Sea, an aging propeller plane tumbles from the sky.
The first headline was sabotage.
Investigators consider a string of possibilities. It takes 2 years to find the cause.
Unbelievable.
It's something that's never been seen in any previous investigation.
They looked at that and said, man, oh man, how could that be?
It would lead to arrests half a world away and call into question the safety of one of the world's most important planes, Air Force One.
It reached all the way to the aviation that flies around the President of the United States.
.30 p.m., September the 8th, 1989.
Oh, hang on.
Knut Tvetem and Finn Petter Berg are flying a charter flight from Oslo, Norway, to the German city of Hamburg.
Partnair 394, radar service terminated.
The plane is about 100 kilometers from the Danish coast.
124.55 by Partnair 394. How was dinner?
Delicious. A little pricey, but delicious.
The two friends have flown around the world together, including remote areas of Africa. They're highly experienced, and both are only months away from retirement.
Copenhagen, good afternoon. Partnair 394.
Maintaining flight level 222.
Partnair 394, good afternoon. Radar contact, Copenhagen control.
394.
The plane is flying 22,000 feet above the North Sea. The aircraft they're flying is a twin-prop Convair 340-580. It's a popular plane for short routes like this one. The plane has been chartered by the Norwegian shipping company Wilhelmsen. All 50 passengers are winners of a company lottery, sending them on a free trip to Hamburg to name a new ship.
Some had maybe been to naming ceremonies before, but the naming ceremonies are quite exciting. And the atmosphere was very, very, very good at the time of leaving.
One of the company's best employees is chosen to give a speech at the christening of the ship in Hamburg.
You have to deliver a speech. And it's not so very often that normal person within a company is giving the honor of naming a ship. But I just felt that that was right.
As the Convair crosses the North Sea, a Norwegian Air Force F-16 approaches the plane on its way home.
Whoa, look at that, 11 o'clock. F-16.
Suddenly, the plane experiences a violent shock. The crew is caught by surprise. The plane begins rolling upside down. Air traffic control notices that Partnair 394 is off course and falling from the sky.
Partnair 394, Copenhagen control. Please report new flight level.
The crew is struggling to save the plane and the lives of everyone on board.
Terrain, what's the flight level?
Oh, up.
Terrain.
Oh, up.
Please report new flight level.
Then it disappears. It seems as though the charter flight has crashed into the sea.
Partnair 394 en route to Hamburg is off radar.
Rescue teams race to the crash site, nearly 20 kilometers north of the Danish coast. They find only wreckage and bodies. All 55 people who were on the flight are dead.
I knew all the people. Some were close friends, some were less close, but I knew them all. And the pressure then felt double.
The shipping company is devastated by the news. Half the staff from its head office has been killed. It's the biggest airline disaster in Norwegian history. The nation is in shock. Jan Ovind is a young reporter for Norway's largest newspaper. He's assigned to cover this story.
One of the inspectors in the Norwegian FAA jumped to the conclusion that it had to be sabotage. And it was also stated by one of the Danish rescue team leaders, who said that they had no distress call. It just fell out of the sky, which meant it had to be a bomb or something. And somebody drew links to Lockerbie the year before.
In December 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. The evidence in that case is pointing conclusively to a bomb. Norwegian journalists uncover an intriguing fact about the Partnair plane.
Our Prime Minister at the time, Gro Harlem Brundtland, she used the plane on her campaign trip to the north of Norway. And I guess she used it for 2 or 3 days. And that was just 2 or 3 days before it crashed.
The nation wonders, could the tragedy have been a botched assassination attempt?
The first headline was sabotage then on the whole front page.
A bomb would explain the plane's sudden plunge from the sky. Had the 55 people on board been the innocent victims of a murderer? Investigators looking into the mysterious downing of a passenger jet over the North Sea are facing a stunning possibility: that the plane was deliberately sabotaged. The Norwegian Accident Investigation Board recruits an Air Force investigator, Finn Heimdall, to join the team. It will be a severe test of his investigative skills.
It's good to be here. I started many years ago with the Air Force. And of course, I saw some investigations mishandled terribly, and I thought it can be done better than that.
Investigators hear from several witnesses who lend support to the idea that the plane was sabotaged. A young man claims to have heard a cannon-like sound coming from the crash site off the Danish coast. It may have been the explosion that brought down the Partnair plane. Searchers scour the surface of the sea for floating debris and for victims of the crash. Eventually, all but 5 bodies are found. They're taken to Denmark for autopsies. Those examinations reveal that some of the victims have small puncture-like wounds. This supports the notion that a bomb brought down Partnair Flight 394. An autopsy on the first officer also uncovers something unusual. A complete, unbroken toothpick is discovered in his stomach.
Yeah, that was a odd finding, really, because it was pointed in both ends, and how can you swallow a toothpick like that? So he must have been exposed to a very shocking experience.
please report new flight level.
But investigators can't confirm that a bomb brought down the plane. They'll need to know more about the final moments of Flight 394.
Partnair 394 en route to Hamburg is off radar.
Nine separate radar stations tracked its final seconds. They could provide valuable clues. The most intriguing readings come from a military radar station in Sweden. Operators there tracked the Partnair flight as it crossed the North Sea.
It started 1436.
The military radar has detected something unexpected. There is another object in the same airspace as the plane. It is not another airplane. It appears as Flight 394 started to plummet from 22,000 feet.
Idea what it is?
Simply didn't know what it was from the beginning. We had no idea what it could have been. It took more than half an hour, something like 38 minutes, and the question was, what is light enough to fall that slowly and solid enough to give radar returns like that?
Whatever the mysterious object was, it now lies at the bottom of the sea. A month after the crash, investigators are busy recovering sunken wreckage. They've plotted the position of the wreckage on the ocean floor using side-scan sonar. It sends out sound waves that are reflected back when they encounter objects. The sonar equipment has painted a remarkably accurate picture of the underwater wreckage. It helps investigators see that the plane parts have settled over a 2-kilometer wide area. It's an important piece of evidence.
It was evident that the aircraft had come apart in the air. It hadn't hit the sea in one piece, that was for sure.
The Midair breakup suggests a bomb brought down the plane. But it will take weeks to prove this. In the meantime, investigators hope the plane's black boxes will provide more immediate insight into the crash. The plane's voice recorder and eventually its data recorder are recovered from the seabed and sent to labs for analysis. Both boxes were damaged in the crash. Investigators hope the damage to the boxes didn't affect the data.
Well, let's see what we got.
The voice recorder may have picked up a conversation between the pilots that can explain what happened on board.
Avionics, CVR.
On? That's required.
Auto feather system.
Armed to 2 green.
The device usually records the final minutes of a flight, but this CVR has done the opposite.
Beta lights off.
Power.
It recorded the start of the flight, but then mysteriously stopped recording just before the plane took off.
Well, it had recorded the conversation on the ground, but as soon as the engines were upshifted to normal RPM for takeoff, it ceased operations. So that was a disappointment to us.
But the malfunctioning CVR did pick up an intriguing exchange between the two pilots.
How's the weather in Hamburg?
It's clear skies, good visibility.
Hope it stays that way.
The CVR does tell investigators that Flight 394 began with an unusual problem.
Partner was in financial dire straits, and we found out that just a few hours before the plane took off, the Norwegian aviation authorities sent out a telex to tell all the airports in Norway to don't let a partner plane take off because they owe a lot of money in non-paid charges and fees.
They won't release us for takeoff until we pay the catering bill.
How much you got on ya?
Seriously?
Huh?
Probably enough, actually. I'll take care of it then.
The first officer was forced to leave the cockpit to pay the caterers for onboard meals. Investigators check maintenance records to find out why the CVR only recorded the crew's conversation while they were on the ground. They discover that the plane's cockpit voice recorder had been modified more than 10 years earlier.
Modified to switch to primary AC.
Lights up.
It was altered so that when the engines were given full power for takeoff,
Your power.
the CVR would automatically switch from the plane's batteries to its generator.
And that modification was not working on this aircraft.
Neither pilot realized that as the engines were revved up for takeoff, power to the CVR was actually cut off.
Anytime you get key investigation components such as the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder that don't work correctly, it brings into question the thoroughness of the maintenance and also the continued operation, safe operation of the airplanes.
The malfunctioning voice recorder and the unpaid catering bill lead investigators to look more closely at the history of the airplane and the company that owned it, Partnair Airlines. Partnair operated a fleet of mostly older planes that flew to northern European destinations. The Convair that crashed into the North Sea was one of the airline's most recent acquisitions. But the plane itself was 36 years old. It had a complicated history of both ownership and modification. The biggest change was to the plane's engines.
The really important modification was upgrading the engines to turbine engines.
On prop planes, the propeller moves air backwards, propelling the plane forward. Early prop planes used piston engines to turn the propeller. But turbine engines, which use a series of fans, not pistons, to compress air, generate substantially more power. Heimdall learns that in 1960, the plane's original piston engines were removed and powerful new turboprops were bolted to the wings. It's a modification that provides more power, but could pose a risk.
When there was a tremendous increase of horsepower installing the turbine engines, I was wondering what that was doing to the structure of the aircraft.
Heimdall has been placed in charge of analyzing the plane's engines. He wants to know if the turbine engines could have torn the aging plane apart.
I started asking the question, how can an aircraft fly itself to pieces in midair?
The plane's flight data recorder should tell investigators about the operation of the engines in the moment before the crash. The recorder from this flight is a primitive analog model.
Used a metal foil strip that rotated, and some marking pins actually scratched on the metal surface, on the piece of metal.
The antiquated data recorder proves to be another frustration for investigators. It didn't record many of the parameters it was supposed to. But more mysteriously, the needle seems to have recorded certain signals twice. The double line confounds experts who analyze the device.
We had no experience with anything like that. We contacted several experts, but none had experience with this before.
Yeah, I've never seen that before.
The flight data doesn't offer investigators any immediate revelations about the crash. Heimdall now wonders if the very fact that the recorder was malfunctioning could be a clue in itself. He decides to send the flight data recorder back to the American company that made it for further analysis. Investigators painstakingly reconstruct the Partnair plane.
The Norwegian team recovered the airplane with assistance from the local authorities, the Danish authorities, I believe, and decided to reconstruct the airplane. A reconstruction is like putting together a puzzle that helps investigators focus the investigation on areas that need to be looked at and helps prioritize the investigation.
As the fuselage takes shape, the reconstructed plane provides investigators with some stunning evidence.
The only thing that would destroy the aircraft at cruising level would be an explosion. So, and some of the parts looked maybe a bit suspicious.
Suspicious for what's on them.
There were rumors that it was found explosives in the Partnair plane.
There are traces of a powerful military explosive. The amount is small, but the press gets wind of it. The explosive residue could be from a bomb on board the plane, or from another source. A NATO war exercise called Operation Sharp Spear was taking place that same day near the flight path of Flight 394.
One of the pilots I talked to, he said, I guess it might have been the so-called cold rocket, test rocket, might have gone through one of the wings or the fuselage.
Many people now wonder if an errant warhead played a role in bringing down the plane.
Full up, terrain. Full up, terrain. Full up.
But when the explosive residue is analyzed, it's found not to have been from a bomb or a warhead. There simply isn't enough of it on the plane.
There was a small sign of explosives, but that was a very low level and looked more like a contamination than anything else.
Many battles have been fought off the Danish coast. The sea is littered with old munitions. Investigators believe the plane picked up some explosive residue while lying on the ocean floor. Explosives are ruled out as a cause of this crash. Metallurgist Terry Heaslip has been brought in. He examines the plane's reconstructed tail and makes a startling observation. Pieces of the plane's skin show evidence of damage from overheating.
Which means that it was flexing. And you take a coat hanger and you go like that, back and forth. If you hold it close to where it's going to break, you'll burn your hand because you develop heat where you're doing the fatigue. It's the same thing on an airplane.
The evidence is pointing to a problem with the plane's tail. Investigators are keen to look at a massive generator recovered from the rear of the aircraft. The auxiliary power unit is housed inside the Convair's rear fin. It's a backup power generator that's usually only used while the plane is on the ground. Heimdall inspects the device and discovers that some melted plastic parts from the plane's cabin have found their way inside the APU's turbine. It gives him an important new piece of information about what was happening on the plane at the moment it failed.
Meaning that the cabin had failed when the APU was still operating.
The APU should not have been running while the plane was in the air. The fact that it was means the APU could be behind this crash. Investigators try to learn more about what happened on the day of the crash. They interview the mechanic who inspected the plane that morning. He reports that one of the plane's two main generators wasn't working, and that he wasn't able to repair it. Regulations demand that the plane have two sources of power before it's allowed to take off. The first officer comes up with a solution that will allow the flight to leave. He tells the airline that he will use the auxiliary power unit throughout the flight as a substitute for the malfunctioning main generator.
Okay, I want you to write this in the logbook. Released for flight with APU generator operative. We'll use the APU to power the left side AC system. APU is coming on. lights off.
Your power.
During his inspection of the APU, Heimdall makes an important discovery.
When I saw the part, I saw that it was not an aircraft standard part at all. It was made in a very primitive way by a piece of iron and welding it together in a substandard way.
He notices that one of the mounts attaching the APU to the plane is broken. The unit contains a rapidly spinning turbine that generates electricity. If it wasn't properly held in place, it could have caused this crash. Investigators need to know if the broken APU caused the crash. They'll soon discover that it's just a piece of a much more troubling puzzle. Investigators have discovered that Partnair Flight 394 was flying with a broken APU mount. Metallurgist Terry Heaslip performs extensive testing on the failed part.
My initial reaction was that the welding was bad, was probably inappropriate.
Heaslip wants to know when the strut broke. If it happened during the plane's last flight, it could explain the accident.
I could see the impact markings and the progression markings on it that showed that it did not fail in a single overload during this last accident flight.
The way the broken mount is worn down also tells Heaslip that the mount holding the APU in place didn't break on the day of the accident. It was broken long before Flight 394 took off. Investigators now need to know what effect the broken mount had on the flight.
40,000 RPMs. Do a lot of damage.
The APU is a large gyroscope having a tremendous amount of energy in it when it's rotating. And if that energy is transmitted to the surroundings, the fuselage, the structure, it could impact the whole vibration pattern in the tail.
Investigators want to know if anyone had felt vibrations on this particular plane. Interviews with people who flew on it provide some answers.
Listen, we appreciate your coming in. Thanks a lot. Now, you said you felt some rumbling on the plane, is that right?
One person stated that the plane that crashed vibrated far more than the two other Convairs owned by the company.
Did anything seem unusual on the plane?
But others failed to mention the vibrations.
Had a good flight.
It's a puzzling situation. Investigators know the APU mount was broken before the flight, but they still don't know if it even played a role in the crash, or whether it would have affected the plane's tail. Then the reconstruction begins to clear things up. Heimdall discovers that two doors from the plane's tail have not been found.
When we reassembled the parts from the tail, we saw that the rudder had been torn apart in two major pieces and some parts were missing. In particular, the doors between the fin and the rudder were missing.
The shroud doors are two small doors located on the vertical fin of the plane. They provide mechanics with access to weights inside the fin that control the rudder's movement. Heimdall makes a dramatic find about the doors themselves. They were constructed with an aluminium honeycomb liner. From his days in the Air Force, Heimdall knows they have a unique property.
This is thin aluminum foil, as you know, and it has the good reflective properties for radar, and it's very light. The military use it to disturb radar signals, call it chaff.
Investigators now realize that the unidentified object picked up by Swedish radar was probably a piece of one of the shroud doors.
But when we connected the missing doors and honeycomb with the radar data, we knew that it had happened up at cruising altitude, because the slow-falling object had come from very high level, cruising altitude practically.
Investigators conclude that the tail began to break apart at 22,000 feet before it plummeted from the sky. But why had the doors fallen off in mid-flight? Whatever caused the shroud doors to tear off likely caused the crash. Investigators know that the rudder's counterweights are located just inside the shroud doors. If a rudder moves too violently from side to side, the weights do as well.
We found enough pieces to show that it was just pounding these doors. And the first real components that came off were the honeycomb in those doors.
Investigators conclude that around the time of the accident, something caused the rudder to swing violently back and forth, but they still don't know what.
The APU with the broken front shock mount on its own, running in flight, would not cause the aircraft to come apart and the tail to come apart. There had to be extra factors there for that to occur.
Investigators continue searching for those extra factors. Then Partnair Airlines proposes one. They point to the F-16 that passed over the plane just minutes before the plane veered off course.
Whoa, look at that, 11 o'clock.
F-16.
Partnair claims the military jet was flying faster than it should have been. They also believe that it came much closer to the flight than officially reported.
Partner, they contacted the Swedish investigator, and he came out with the answer that the F-16 could probably have gone through the sound barrier as it passed just over the Partner plane. When a fighter jet or any other plane breaks the sound barrier, you have this pressure wave, and their theory was that this pressure wave just got the plane to disintegrate in the air.
But the Norwegian F-16 pilot testifies that he was more than 1,000 feet above the convoy when he passed it. Investigators calculate just how close the F-16 would have had to be in order to seriously disturb Flight 394. They determined that for the F-16's pressure wave to have affected the convoy, it would have had to fly within a few meters of the plane. There's no evidence the two planes were ever that close.
Okay, good work.
90% of the plane's wreckage has been recovered from the sea. But investigators still don't know what caused the convoy's tail to come off in midair. During the course of the investigation, Finn Heimdall is given a promotion, but he has no idea how to solve the puzzle that haunts his nation.
They asked me to be in charge of the rest of the hardware investigation. I was standing in a heap of wrecked parts and thinking I'll never get to an end of this.
Investigators get a break when the faulty flight data recorder is analyzed in the United States. The manufacturer has asked its top expert to come out of retirement and examine the device.
Manufacturer Fairchild referred us to a previous employee, and we found him in California.
The expert tells investigators that the needle that was supposed to be recording the plane's altitude was shaking so much that it was leaving another mark on the foil. But then he goes one step further. The FDR has a capacity to record for hundreds of hours. By unspooling the metal foil completely, he sees that the FDR has been vibrating severely for months.
We saw that this had happened something like 360 operations hours before the accident.
I had never seen an abnormality like that before, and it took us a while to figure out what was going on here.
It now seems the APU wasn't the only thing vibrating on this plane. Investigators decide to chart the history of the vibrations chronologically. They notice an unusual change in the pattern of vibrations. 2 months before the crash, the vibrations suddenly stopped for a number of weeks.
Virtually no vibrations for at least 16 flights.
It was increasing intensity and frequency up to the summer of '89. And then the pattern changed.
After getting better, the pattern of vibrations got worse again, right up until the crash.
What happened here?
Investigators now need to find out what changed on the plane during the 2-week period when the vibrations stopped.
Why was it out of service? Where was the work done?
The airline tells investigators that during that time, the plane was receiving a major overhaul in Western Canada.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
The work was done by the plane's previous owner, a Canadian company that specializes in servicing Convairs. During the various test flights there, the FDR recorded almost no excessive vibrations. This healthy pattern continued on several passenger flights once the overhaul was done and the plane returned to Norway. Investigators review the maintenance records. Heimdall finds that during the overhaul, mechanics found signs of wear on one of the 4 bolts that connect the vertical fin to the plane's tail. These 4 bolts are the only things holding the tail to the fuselage. During the overhaul of the Convair in July of 1989, a mechanic replaced one of the 4 bolts. The information from the flight data recorder reveals that the vibrations in the tail stopped right after that 1 bolt was replaced.
You see that? And as they go across.
Incredibly, investigators are able to recover all 4 of the bolts which were holding the tail in place. Terry Heaslip thoroughly analyzes the bolts. He makes a final stunning discovery. The 3 bolts that weren't replaced were not approved parts.
We did metallurgical testing and we did mechanical testing. And by doing all of these analyses, we worked out that the 3 of the assemblies were not up to scratch. They were bogus assemblies.
His analysis shows that the faulty bolts were incorrectly heat-treated when they were made. As a result, they are only 60% as strong as they should have been. Investigators finally know why the tail was vibrating for months.
Got something for me?
3 of the bolts holding it in place were too weak.
They just weren't hard enough.
Unbelievable.
3 bolts holding the tail to the rest of the plane were not authentic parts. They were well-disguised fakes. The weak bolts mean investigators now must answer a critical question.
Why didn't the tail come off in the previous 16 flights where it vibrated excessively? Why this last flight?
Investigators already know that on the day of the accident flight, a power generator wasn't working, and that the pilots improvised a solution.
Okay, I want you to write this in the logbook. Released for flight with APU generator operative. We'll use the APU to power the left side AC system. APU is coming on.
The pilots didn't realize that the APU mount was broken and the motor was vibrating considerably. Their decision to run it throughout the flight made a bad situation worse.
The reason why things got bad on this particular flight is that the APU was literally floating on 2 mounts instead of 3.
This, along with the faulty bolts, created even more vibrations in the tail of the plane.
And when you get the two of them shaking, if they ever get into sync, what we call resonance with each other, disaster.
The investigators conclude that the vibrations in the tail and the vibrations from the APU could have combined into a lethal force.
Now, this is what we got from the guys at MIT. Technically, the vibrations could have torn the plane apart.
If the two loose items start to vibrate in the same frequency, now you're going to get, or a multiple of that frequency, you get what's called coupled harmonics. And the one vibration is feeding the other one. They're feeding each other and making each other worse and worse.
The most famous example of coupled harmonics occurred on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state in 1940. The newly built steel and concrete bridge began swaying lengthwise, and then a crosswind started dipping it left to right. The two vibrations moving in different directions combined to create a violent twisting motion that tore the bridge apart. Investigators calculate that the same effect tore apart Flight 394.
And we said, my gosh, that's exactly the phenomenon we have here.
This lethal combination of vibrations caused the tail to sway back and forth so violently that the rudder jammed to the left. This forced the plane into a left turn so abrupt that it increased airflow over the right wing, creating greater lift and causing the aircraft to roll. The plane recovered briefly, but the rudder jams to the left again, and the shroud doors explode. It rolls a second time, and the tail begins to disintegrate. After that, the crew didn't have a hope. Investigators conclude that it was the 3 bogus bolts that initiated the Partnair crash.
And I looked at that and said, man, oh man, how could that be in a crucial component, a crucial fitting like that in the tail? I couldn't believe it.
The report on Partnair Flight 394 sends shockwaves throughout the aviation industry. It's the first time that a fatal plane crash has been linked to unapproved spare parts. It raises a frightening question. How many of the parts being put into planes around the world are bogus?
The Partnair crash, that was the seminal event that started people actually having to recognize the unapproved parts problem and the fact that the worldwide inventories of aircraft parts, in fact, were contaminated.
There are 6 million moving parts on a 747 alone. The spare parts business is a $45 billion industry. And at the time of the crash, that industry was largely unregulated. Mary Schiavo is the former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, the agency that oversees the FAA.
No one knew how large the problem was. They knew it was a problem because of a crash, but how big was the problem in the United States? So we set out to measure it. We started by auditing the FAA's own parts bins. And the FAA's own parts bins contained 39% bogus parts. What we found is if the parts had come from a parts broker, which was a huge percentage of the parts supply industry, 95% of them were not authentic.
The FAA would soon find bogus parts on an airplane widely considered to be the most secure plane on Earth. There are 5,000 parts brokers in the United States, many of them in the Miami area.
Parts brokers had no regulation whatsoever. You had a telephone and a fax. You were a parts broker. Overnight, you could be in the parts brokerage business, and you could get them anywhere you chose. You could get them from junkyards, you could get them from scrap facilities, you could get them from old planes, you could get them from crashes, you could get them from people who are willing to manufacture and don't care about the law.
Spare parts for airplanes are expensive, A single bolt, like the one holding on the Partnair Flight's vertical fin, can cost up to $250. A bogus one can cost as little as $30.
Which makes it a bargain. And when you have situations like you have today, and airlines are bottom line driven, and you've got 8 or 10 major airlines in the United States, for example, that are on the verge of bankruptcy, they're looking to cut costs.
The FAA launches a major investigation into illegal parts and uses sting operations to uncover unscrupulous dealers. Investigators uncover a black market industry that makes thousands of worn and inferior parts look brand new.
These are really good counterfeits. It's very difficult to tell.
At the time of the Partnair accident, there were checks and balances in the system that were supposed to keep bogus parts from getting on major airlines. For instance, each spare part needs someone's signature to verify its authenticity.
It has to have some documentation that states that it's airworthy. It has to have a maintenance release by some certificated entity.
But investigators discover that in addition to a huge market in spare parts, there's also a burgeoning market for counterfeit FAA tags.
We'd execute search warrants and find that people had printed stacks of fake yellow tags, and in many cases they'd sign with the name of an actual inspector, but they just forged a signature.
The tag in this business is worth more than the part.
At first, investigators believe the problem is mostly with smaller airlines.
Smaller operators and repair stations are usually the people who are most vulnerable to this aftermarket broker parts problem.
They're shocked when they discover that bogus parts have been found on what is supposed to be the most tightly controlled plane in the world, Air Force One.
It reached all the way to what many people consider literally the highest levels of aviation, the aviation that flies around the President of the United States. Supposedly in an airtight supply chain, we had bogus parts cases that touched those aircraft.
The FAA responds quickly. More than 100 dealers are arrested.
With every conviction, we were able to raise the level of awareness, not only of the problem, but of the severe consequences if you want to risk somebody's life. And I actually think that the most important thing that we did was get criminal convictions.
As a result of their investigation, the FAA institutes a much more rigorous system for documenting airplane parts. They threaten airlines with criminal charges if they knowingly accept bogus parts.
Things are different today because we have a whole body of regulations, much more than we had in the 80s and 90s even, to address the problem.
You have to get the mechanic who's actually got the wrench in his hand to a point of sophistication where he's knowledgeable enough to smell a bad part, to smell a bad piece of paper. And it is possible to do.
The new regulations achieved their goal. In the 2 decades following the crash of Partnair 394, there wasn't a single fatal accident attributed to bogus parts. Years after the Partnair crash, Finn Heimdall became the head of the Norwegian Accident Investigation Board.
Doing, my friend?
It was a major puzzle that an aircraft, for no obvious reason, could more or less disintegrate in midair.
His report into the accident resulted in major changes that likely saved lives.
That's a positive thing, but the negative, of course, is the tragedy, the personal tragedy to many people.
One of the smallest parts on a Norwegian charter plane failed in 1989. Because investigators found the cause of that accident, passengers around the world are safer. less likely to be on a plane that's fitted with bogus parts. Outside one of India's busiest airports, the early evening sky ignites into a fireball.
This cloud just lit up. Felt like you could feel the heat.
Flaming wreckage falls from the sky. It's a horrifying crash.
I realized that the clumps that I saw all around me were either the remnants of the aircraft or dead bodies.
When investigators arrive, they find the twisted remains of 2 passenger jets. 349 people are dead. Vital clues are buried deep underground. Investigators must piece together the day's events.
Saudi 763 will maintain 140.
Kazakh 1907, now reach 150.
How had 2 crews that should have known each other's positions ended up in the world's deadliest mid-air collision? Indira Gandhi International Airport, New Delhi. A gateway to India. November the 12th, 1996.
Busy?
Air traffic controller VK Dutta arrives for the late afternoon shift.
There was a ward supervisory officer. There was one person who was sitting beside me and he was assisting me. And the things were all normal.
But normal at Indira Gandhi doesn't mean calm. This is becoming one of the most congested airports in the world. In 1990, the government of India signed open skies agreements with several different countries. Those pacts have made it easier for foreign airlines to land at Indian airports. Many airlines are taking advantage of the new policy. Air traffic controllers are now handling more traffic than ever.
The open sky policy acted as a catalyst in the air traffic growth. The volume of traffic grew from, I believe, 175 movement a day to around 225 movement a day.
We have to perform during that time. So whether 10 aircraft come on that time or 20 comes, so you have to handle them.
Just past 6 o'clock, Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 takes off into the sunset.
Gear up. Gear up. Clear on left.
Captain Khalid Al-Shabaili powers the Boeing 747 away from the runway. His co-pilot, Nazir Khan, handles all radio communication. There are 289 passengers on board. Many are Indian workers returning to their jobs in the Middle East.
Saudi 763, airborne 03, contact radar 127.9.
While Flight 763 was on the runway, its movements were tracked and directed by an air traffic controller in the airport's tower.
279, good day.
But shortly after the plane takes off, the tower passes the pilots over to approach controller VK Dutta, who's in another room at the airport. Approach controllers at Indira Gandhi guide planes through the airspace beyond the runways. They're in charge of all arriving and departing flights within 110 kilometers.
The approach controller normally is responsible for arrival and departures of the aircraft which are coming in. They are safely and expeditiously, they are brought to the final approach.
Tonight, Dutta is controlling 5 flights. Some of these are leaving the airport, while others are coming in. His task is to keep those planes spaced safely apart, but not so far apart as to cause any delays.
There's a continuous coordination with the tower who handles the ground traffic. So he would tell approach controller that this fellow is ready, and he is to be accommodated between these 2 flights. So that kind of dynamics we were doing at that time.
Saudi 763 approaching flight level 100.
Roger, climb, flight level 140.
Clear to climb 140, Saudi 763.
This evening, a United States Air Force cargo plane is coming in for a landing. Even though it's an Air Force jet, this flight is Dutta's responsibility.
I think we probably had 3 or 4 back and forths with the controller where he was verifying our altitude or checking on our altitude, telling us about other traffic in the vicinity.
Saudi 763 approaching 140 for higher.
Saudi Flight 763 reaches its last assigned altitude of 14,000 feet. The pilots request permission to fly higher.
Roger, maintain flight level 140. Stand by for higher.
In order to coordinate incoming and outgoing traffic, Dutta wants the Saudi flight to stop climbing.
Saudi 763 will maintain 140.
Dutta is concerned with another plane, now flying east for a landing at Indira Gandhi Airport. It's a passenger jet operated by Kazakhstan Airlines. The Ilyushin 76 is a massive Russian plane. Originally built for the military, a modified version is now widely used as a commercial airliner. Dutta wants it to pass over top of the Saudi flight before landing. After that, he'll let the Saudis continue their climb.
They were supposed to cross maintaining 1,000 feet of separation.
Kazakh 1907, now reaching 150, 46 miles from Delta Papa November.
Roger, maintain flight level 150. Identify traffic 12 o'clock reciprocal, Saudi Boeing 747.
Dutta doesn't want the Kazakh flight to be surprised to see the Saudi jet. Since planes don't have radar to track other aircraft, they rely on controllers to warn them about other planes nearby.
Maintaining 150, Kazakh 1907, will report. How many miles?
All pilots tuned to the approach control radio frequency are able to hear one another as they communicate with the ground.
How many miles?
8 miles now.
It was strictly visual and trying to pick up on the radios where everyone else is at and what they're up to.
Traffic is at 8 miles, level 140.
Suddenly, a massive explosion shatters the evening's calm.
All at once, out of the right side of the window, right side of the cockpit, this cloud just lit up.
Those missiles?
To my mind's eye, there were missiles kind of corkscrewing, picking up speed was what they looked like, and they looked like they were coming right at us. We actually started veering the aircraft away before it became apparent that they weren't coming at us.
The Saudi Airlines jet spirals towards the ground.
Billy, this is 1815.
1815, say again?
Got on the radio right away, called the controller.
We saw something that looks like a big explosion.
Then it struck to me that something has gone wrong.
On Dutta's radar screen, both the Saudi jet and the Kazakh plane have simply vanished.
When I saw other blips are coming and So I watched the sweep again. But they were not there at all.
We then heard the controller call for the Saudi Air jet and the Aleutian.
Saudi 763.
With no response. That was obviously very bone-chilling.
Something tragic has happened in the skies near New Delhi's airport. VK Dutta is about to become the target of an investigation into one of the deadliest plane crashes of all time.
Kazakh 1907, report your position.
At New Delhi's airport, a sense of dread is growing. 2 planes have vanished from approach control's radar.
The worst nightmare an air traffic controller has as the Midair police.
Saudi 763.
Together, the 2 missing planes were carrying 349 people.
Kazakh 1907, report position.
I gave 1 or 2 calls to Kazakh or Saudi.
Saudi 763.
I forward how many kids I have, where my wife is, whom I am related to.
US Air Force pilot Captain Tim Place soon confirms the worst.
Delhi, this is 1815.
1815.
What did you see? 2 distinct fires on the ground.
2 fires on the ground. Confirm?
Confirm. Confirm.
Roger.
My senior came to me, so I told him the accident happened. I told people who were to do search and rescue that the aircraft have crashed at 40 nautical miles west of Delhi.
2 planes have gone down over Chakri Dadri.
Chakri Dadri is a town 65 kilometers west of New Delhi. Its mustard and grain fields are now burning with the twisted wreckage of 2 ruined airplanes.
All of a sudden, the sky turned a bright red color, and I saw fire and smoke.
One plane started to come towards us. There was fire and parts of the plane were flying everywhere. People were running. The plane's engine broke off and the plane started to spin out of control and fell into the field.
I was told that there's been a mid-air collision. Apparently there's a jumbo jet which may be involved, and why don't you just head out? There was this adrenaline rush in that sense. I was very new in the business, and I knew I had to get that story.
Vishnu Som is assigned to report on the crash for New Delhi television. He arrives in the darkness of night a few hours after the crash.
We parked our vehicle on the side of the road, and it was, there was a fair bit of moonlight.
He and his cameraman are one of the first media crews to arrive on the scene.
Hey, turn off the light. Don't want to attract attention. Police have likely cordoned off the area.
I stepped onto the field, and I thought it was a fallow field. Nothing was growing over there because it was just sand. And because it was dark and our only visual reference was the moonlight, we just sort of kept going. And then I remember seeing clumps around me, just these little piles on all sides. And because there wasn't enough light, I didn't know what exactly it was. And then I stopped because I said, something's terribly wrong over here.
Turn on your light. Turn on your light.
I realized that the clumps that I saw all around me were either the remnants of the aircraft or dead bodies. there was a tree just maybe 15 feet away from me. To my right, there was this burnt corpse on that tree, and that's an image which comes back and continues to haunt me even after so many years.
As night turns to day, hope of finding any survivors fades. None of the passengers aboard either plane has survived. 349 people are dead. It's the worst mid-air collision of all time. News of the crash spreads around the world.
What remains clear is that there was more than one set of factors that might have resulted in the collision.
We have two very separate wreckage fields.
Captain KPS Nair is one of the first investigators on the scene.
I was aghast, horrified. I can't explain it because I had not seen anything like that before. It is something which I can't explain.
The Kazakh flight and the Saudi Airlines jet have fallen 7 kilometers from each other. Investigators have two separate crash sites to examine, but they know one cause will explain both accidents.
It's unlike a single aircraft falling somewhere. Two large-bodied aircraft colliding each other in the sky. There are different causes.
How had two planes that were supposed to be 1,000 feet apart collided? Investigators consider three possibilities. An error on the part of the air traffic controller, an error by one of the crews, or the failure of an instrument on one of the planes. They hope the mangled wreckage will hold the clues they need. Their first priority is to find the black boxes from both planes. They record cockpit conversations along with critical data about the flight, like its altitude, speed, and heading. Although fire has ravaged the wreck sites, the black boxes from both planes are found on the first day of the investigation. But for the moment, they hold their secrets. It will take several months for experts to extract data from the recorders. In the meantime, investigators focus on conversations between the two planes and the air traffic controller.
In this particular case, we had the evidence of the ATC transcript.
Without onboard radar, the planes around Delhi's airport rely on air traffic controllers to guide them. VK Dutta comes under enormous pressure. Did he make mistakes that caused the worst mid-air collision ever?
Those times were bad. These media people, they crowd foul. So I told them that, there was no fault of mine.
Hi, I'm VK Dutta. I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Have a seat.
Investigators want to know everything that Dutta did on the night of the crash.
Was traffic heavy?
Evenings are always busy.
Dutta's radar doesn't track a plane's altitude. Instead, controllers in New Delhi write a plane's last reported position on a strip of paper. The strips are continually updated. It's the only way for controllers to keep track of the altitude of the planes under their control.
Level information is not there, so level has to be confirmed by the pilot.
Kazakh 1907, now reaching 150.
Air traffic controllers can only know a plane's altitude when the pilots report it.
Are these your notes?
Yes, sir. This is the Kazakh one, and this is the Saudi one.
Investigators learned that Dutta was in charge of 5 flights at the time of the accident, and that the Saudi and Kazakh flights were flying in opposite directions of the same aerial pathway. The area that Dutta manages is divided into a network of air corridors. Controllers use them to channel flights in and out of the airport. But many of the corridors are used for military flights. In fact, even at such a busy airport, there's only one main corridor for commercial planes. In cases like this, there are strict rules he has to follow.
Between two aircraft, the requirements specify a vertical minimum separation of 1,000 feet.
When aircraft fly through the sky, they leave turbulence in their wake, like boats on the water. It can affect the planes around them. Air traffic controllers deal with this by keeping planes at different altitudes.
Roger, maintain flight level 140, stand by for higher.
Dutta was supposed to ensure that the two planes were 1,000 feet apart as they approached each other. He planned to do what he'd done many times before, have the incoming plane pass 1,000 feet over top of the outbound plane. It was a routine procedure, but somehow the two planes had ended up on a collision course. One of the two planes was not where it should have been. Investigators wonder if Dutta made a mistake that led to the horrific crash. Poring through the ATC transcripts, investigators quickly learned that Dutta had given the two planes the proper directions. But since his radar doesn't display altitude, there was no way for him to tell if the planes followed those instructions. Investigators are so convinced that Dutta did nothing wrong that 3 days after the crash, he's back on duty.
When my family and other people heard this, there was a little sigh of relief that, our guy is safe.
Investigators return to the crash site. They are hoping to recover certain instruments from the two aircraft. Perhaps a mechanical failure had led one of the planes off course.
Normally, the altimeter would have stopped at that point where the accident took place. And we wanted to know what altitude they were registering at the time of the accident.
But the Saudi cockpit has plunged deep into the ground. The accident investigation becomes an excavation.
The Saudis' nose portion was well below the earth. It was about 10 to 12 meters below. The end of the nose had gone that far below. Machines had to be brought in, excavators, to dig up and lift the cockpit of the Saudi aircraft.
The altimeters of the Kazakh flight are easier to find. That plane didn't crash nose first. There's some chance there are clues about its exact altitude at the time of the accident. When they're pulled from the wreckage, investigators discover that there is indeed something strange about the altimeters. Both the captain and the co-pilot have an altimeter in front of them, but in this case, they do not have the same reading.
There was a difference between the two by about 300 feet.
Strange.
Perhaps the conflicting altimeters had led the crew off course. But the difference in readings may simply have been caused by the force of the crash. At this point, investigators don't know.
Mostly there and there, as close as you can get it.
Investigators need to discover which of the two planes was at the wrong altitude. They explore other evidence. The pattern of the damage on the two planes may help answer a critical question.
What was the relative angle between the two aircraft at the time of their contact?
Most of the pieces from the two planes are kilometers apart, but a large section of the tail from the Saudi aircraft is found near the beginning of the debris field. This suggests it was one of the first pieces to come off that plane.
The significant points of contact in this particular accident in the air was between the tail end of the IL-76 and the wing portion of the Boeing 747 of Saudi Air.
The tail of the Kazakh plane appears to have pierced through the left wing of the Saudi jet. If that's the case, the Kazakh flight hadn't been above the Saudi jet when they collided, as air traffic controllers thought. It must have been below it. It's a puzzling discovery that adds to the mystery. Investigators still don't know which plane was in the wrong airspace. What they do know is that once the two planes hit, there was no hope for either crew. After hitting the other plane's wing, the Kazakh plane's tail tore through the horizontal stabilizer at the rear of the Saudi 747. 5.5 meters of it is torn off. Without it, the Saudi crew can't control their plane.
The result is the aircraft goes into uncontrollable spiral. And in this particular case, if I would say both the aircraft had got into that situation.
What they've found in the wreckage of the two jets frustrates the investigators. They now understand how the planes collided, but they still don't know why they were at the same altitude, or in fact, what altitude they collided at. How had the Kazakh jet, which was supposed to be above the Saudi flight, ended up below it? Almost 2 weeks after the accident, Captain Ashok Verma joins investigators at the scene.
By that time, the operations for digging the Saudi cockpit had been completed. Whatever equipment was recoverable had been recovered.
Like the rest of the evidence uncovered so far, the instruments from the Saudi plane don't help explain what happened. The force of the crash has completely destroyed them.
I can't find anything. Too much damage.
I agree. Look at this.
We could hardly find any useful material.
With the disappointing discovery, investigators are forced to move on. They've learned all they can at the crash site. The case now depends on what they can find out from the black boxes. Investigators hope that somewhere on the cockpit recordings or buried in the flight data are the clues they need. Where were the planes when they collided? And how had they ended up on a deadly collision course?
Get to the 150! Just at the 140! Start to go!
It's been 3 months since the Midair collision of 2 passenger jets near New Delhi. Investigators have been frustrated by a lack of conclusive evidence. They hope the plane's black boxes will help them solve the case. In order to avoid any suggestion of bias, the boxes from the Saudi flight are being analyzed in England. Technicians from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch try to extract valuable data.
The neutrality of state where the recorders are handled was an essential thing.
Each plane was equipped with 2 black boxes, a flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder. The flight data recorder contains information on dozens of aspects of a plane's performance. Among them, the altitude, the airspeed, and the changes pilots make to the flight controls. The cockpit voice recorder picks up all the conversations in the cockpit.
279, good day.
As investigators try to learn more about the collision near New Delhi, they use the information stored on the black boxes to make a chronology of events. Peter Shepard is head of the recorder section of the Air Accidents Investigation Branch. He'll work backwards from the moment of impact.
The point of collision is reasonably well defined by rapid changes in parameters on each aircraft. If we make that our time zero point, we can then relate that to the individual times and build up a common time base.
First, Shepard and his team concentrate on the Saudi 747.
Saudi 763 approaching 140 for higher.
Roger, maintain flight level 140. Stand by for higher.
Saudi 763 will maintain 140.
The CVR reveals that the Saudi pilots received clear instructions about their altitude and seem to have understood them. After being told to hold at 14,000 feet, there was no discussion of climbing to a higher altitude, which would have taken them into the path of the Kazakh flight. Next, Shepard looks at the flight data recorder to confirm that the Saudi flight actually followed the instructions it was given.
The recorder from the Saudi flight showed us that the altitude had been normal during climb out.
The Saudi pilots leveled off at 14,108 feet, well within their safe corridor.
It had leveled at its assigned altitude of 14,000 feet and continued to fly level.
The Saudi pilots followed the ATC instructions meticulously, which is borne out by their confirmatory calls back to the ATC.
Air traffic controllers wanted the two planes separated by 1,000 feet and wanted the Saudi plane to fly below the Kazakh jet. If the Saudi pilots did nothing unusual, suspicion is growing that somehow it was the Kazakh plane that was in the wrong place. Alarmingly, when investigators examined the information from the Kazakh jet's flight data recorder, they discover that it descended far below the 15,000 feet it was supposed to stay at. Moments before the collision, the Kazakh plane is at 14,100 feet, almost 1,000 feet lower than its assigned altitude and less than 10 feet below the Saudi flight. It then powered directly into the Saudi jet.
The Kazakh crew had not stopped descending at the altitude they were cleared to, that was 15,000 feet.
But why had the Kazakh flight dropped so badly off course?
Kazakh 1907, report position.
Kazakhstan Airlines presents one theory for their plane's dramatic loss of altitude.
The Kazakhstan defense mainly relied on presence of turbulence.
Perhaps a sudden burst of turbulence had forced the plane lower. The data recorder of the Kazakh flight does seem to indicate that the crew had a bumpy ride. It shows two distinct and sudden drops of more than 400 feet. The airline claims both of these drops were caused by turbulence. But Peter Shepard isn't so sure.
When we saw the jumps of 250, 500 feet, our initial response was that these can't be right. I mean, it was the rate at which they changed was beyond that an aircraft could actually perform.
What else could cause the plane to drop so quickly? Or at least seem to drop so quickly? Shepard searches for an explanation.
We tried to resolve the inaccuracies in the Kazakh recording by looking at the other parameters that were recorded and trying to derive altitude using these other recordings.
It's intricate math. By using information including the speed and rate of descent from the flight data recorder, Shepard determines that the plane was on a steady downward approach. The reason for the apparent sharp drops is simple. Shepard learns that the sensor that sends altitude information to the flight data recorder was faulty. It would stick and temporarily stop sending information. When it got unstuck, it would wrongly appear as though the plane had lost considerable altitude.
It's as if there was a bit of glue on one area and it stuck in that. And eventually the altitude changed so much, the force on it made it jump again, and it stuck there for a little while.
Investigators can now conclusively dismiss turbulence as a factor in the collision.
So there's no sudden descent?
Scanning maintenance records, investigators also discover that there was no problem with the Kazakh plane's altimeters. They conclude that the difference found in the cockpit instruments was a result of the crash. It didn't cause it. To understand why the Kazakh plane kept descending after it was told to hold, investigators turn to the cockpit voice recorder. It begins long before the crash itself. Initially, there are no hints that anything is wrong.
Kazakh 1907, report level passing.
Passing 240, Kazakh 1907.
Because the Ilyushin 76 is a modified military plane, it has another unusual feature, a position for a radio operator in the cockpit. Igor Rep mans that position and handles all communications for the Kazakh flight.
Roger, over to Delhi approach 127.9.
127.9, bye-bye, Kazakh 1907.
As the aircraft nears the airport, Rep gets in touch with approach controller Dutta.
Delhi approach, good evening. Kazakh 1907. Passing 230 to 180.
I told Kazakh to descend and maintain flight level 150. That is 15,000 feet.
Roger, Kazakh 1907. Descend flight level 150. Report reaching.
1,000 feet vertical separation is sufficient, and that was granted to the two aircraft.
Kazakh 1907, now reach 150.
The Kazakhstan radio operator had at one time stated reaching flight level 150.
It's just 1 minute before the impact. And at this point, the Kazakh plane appears to be right where it's supposed to be, 1,000 feet higher than the Saudi plane. But investigators know that instead of leveling off, the plane continued to descend.
This is where the trouble starts.
As investigators compare the flight data information to the cockpit voice, they notice something disturbing.
Kazakh 1907, now reach 150.
When Rep calls out that they've descended to 15,000 feet, he's actually over 1,000 feet higher than he thinks he is. Investigators wonder how he could make such an enormous mistake. Why would he say he was at 15,000 feet, when in fact he was at 16,000? They consider the layout of the cockpit.
A radio operator does not have his independent altimeter. There are two metric altimeters fitted in front of, one each in front of the pilots. With some effort, the radio operator could also see this.
Whatever the reason, Rep is mistaken about his plane's height, and he's the only one in contact with the ground. Despite being told to remain at 15,000 feet, the plane continues to descend. As it does, Dutta issues a warning to the Kazakh pilots.
Identified traffic, 12 o'clock reciprocal, Saudi Boeing 747 and 10 miles. Likely to cross in another 5 miles. Report if in sight.
He tells them to watch out for the Saudi flight, but the Kazakh jet just keeps flying lower.
Ahead. Ahead.
Just before the crash, Igor Rep seems to have recognized that the plane is now flying dangerously low. But his warning doesn't come in time.
Keep the 150. Do not descend. Accelerate, Sanyo.
The cockpit voice recorder proves what investigators found in the flight data. At the time of the crash, the Kazakh jet was trying desperately to get back on course.
Get to the 150 because of the 140. Stop the one!
But investigators are still puzzled. Why had the Kazakh plane kept descending?
After ruling out controller's error, ruling out the mechanical failure, do you have to go further into details of human behavior during the operation of a flight?
Kazakhstan is one of several now independent republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union. The national airline has a reputation at Indira Gandhi Airport.
There was always a sense that, these were small fly-by-night operators essentially doing the charter business, and they didn't necessarily follow the conventions of modern Western aviation.
We examined their background of knowledge of English language. The crew in the Soviet states, they pass English examination, but they're not fluent in spoken English.
Verma now listens more closely to the cockpit voice recorder, looking for an indication that the crew misunderstood their instructions. Had a language barrier caused the crash?
How many miles?
Traffic is at 8 miles, level 140.
Did the Kazakh pilots confuse their own altitude with that allocated to the Saudi aircraft?
Report 8 miles.
Verma finds that members of this crew weren't communicating clearly with each other. Igor Rep was responsible for communication with the ground, but there's no indication that the pilot and co-pilot were listening to his instructions.
Switch on, engine inlet heating.
While the rest of the crew was busy discussing arrival procedures, Rep alone seemed to be occupied with their altitude.
Now looking, 1907.
It is a usual practice that the briefing for the arrival is completed before start of descent, so that all crew can pay full attention to the radio.
While the radio operator appears to have understood that the Saudi plane was at 14,000 feet, investigators believe the co-pilot thought that he was cleared to 14,000 feet and continued his descent.
Hold the level. What level were we given?
When the pilot does respond, he seems confused.
I think pilots did not pay that much attention and relied too much on the radio operator and to navigate the aircraft during this critical phase.
The decision to increase power and stop descending ends in tragedy.
Keep the 150. Do not descend. Accelerate, Sanyo. Get to the 150 because of the 140. Don't run!
The final report points a finger squarely at the crew of the Kazakh plane. In the wrong place at the wrong time. A simple misunderstanding led to the deaths of 349 people.
The investigation concluded that the primary cause of this Midair collision was non-adherence to the authorized altitude allocated to the Kazakhstan aircraft.
Investigators are confident they know what caused the worst mid-air collision in aviation history. But there are steps they want the industry to take to help make Indira Gandhi Airport safer. What they find is that the technology that could have prevented this accident was already at the airport.
Saudi 763.
Investigators have determined that poor cockpit communication and a simple misunderstanding caused a devastating accident which killed almost 350 people. But technology existed that could have helped avoid this accident. Systems that would have helped both the pilots in the air and the controllers on the ground. Investigators are especially critical of the radar that was being used in New Delhi.
Air traffic controllers did rely on fairly outdated technology at that stage. There wasn't any secondary radar available at Delhi Airport. There was only an old primary radar.
Primary radar sends out radio signals to locate airplanes in the sky. The signal bounces off the plane and back to a dish on the ground. It reads a plane's position, but not its altitude.
The primary radar gives you a 2D picture.
Secondary radar works differently. A transponder aboard an aircraft sends a message to the ground with key information about the flight, including its altitude.
Saudi 763 approaching flight level 100.
Roger, climb, flight level 140.
On the day of the collision, approach controller VK Dutta could only rely on what the crews told him about their aircraft's altitudes.
Kazakh 1907, now reach 150.
The Kazakh radio operator said that they were flying at 15,000 feet, but Dutta had no way to confirm that. If he had known the Kazakh flight's actual altitude, he could have diverted the Saudi flight from its path.
That is the 3D picture. So you have some time to react to it. You can take the aircraft away.
At the time of the accident, India had ordered a $118 million air traffic control system with secondary radar and more sophisticated communications and navigational equipment. The system had originally been scheduled to be installed 2 weeks before the accident. But on the day of the crash, the system hadn't even been unpacked.
Secondary radar is an advancement on the primary radar. And in this particular case also, by getting the altitude information, it could have been possible that the accident of this nature could have been avoided.
In the year following the accident, there would be 3 near misses near Indira Gandhi Airport. It would take more than 2 years for the secondary radar system to be installed. Today, controllers at Indira Gandhi International Airport see an airplane's flight number, altitude, and heading. It's far more information than controller VK Dutta had available to him on the day of the accident. Experts believe another piece of technology could have helped prevent the collision. TCAS.
TCAS equipment generates caution and warnings for the crew. It allows them time to react, draws their attention to the situation around, and it looks into the vertical separation.
TCAS is a collision avoidance system that can be installed on board airliners. In many countries, the technology is mandatory. It alerts pilots when other flights are coming too close. The system also automatically tells them what evasive action they should take. Neither plane was equipped with TCAS. The Indian Airports Authority has also made the airport safer by redesigning the air corridors coming and going from the runways. At the time of the collision, there was one main air corridor for commercial planes landing and taking off from Indira Gandhi International Airport. With the increase in air traffic, that single corridor was becoming too crowded. In the wake of the accident, more air corridors were opened for commercial flights.
In general, aviation safety standards has improved. The concern for the safety has improved.
Out-of-date technology and poor communication led to this crash. But like almost every aviation accident, it was a chain of seemingly minor events that ended in disaster.
In retrospect, there were some very unlucky people to meet in the sky that night. You know, it's a 1 in a million chance for that to happen. Certainly there were other things that could have helped: radar, collision avoidance systems, and I think we continue to make advances there. I don't worry about flying. Certainly, you know, destiny, I don't know. It was glad we weren't 5 minutes in front of where we were at, that's for sure.
VK Dutta went on to have a long career as an air traffic controller. Today, he works at a college training young controllers.
So I'm chief instructor there. So I'm training ATCUs. I'm addicted to my job. I love it. I really love it.
Datta, who was initially suspected of having caused the crash, helped implement the changes to make New Delhi's airports safer. His efforts have paid off. The airport now handles 20 million passengers a year. Since the new radar system was installed and the new corridors opened, there hasn't been a fatal accident at this airport.